So David Pitonyak, thank you so much for joining us today at our Delovely podcast.
Most welcome.
I have been looking forward to our conversation for quite some time for a number of reasons. You and I knew each other years ago, and I followed your wonderful work. And recently, with the public health crisis, I've been thinking about the publications, the trainings, the articles that you've presented on the impact of trauma on people who we support, who experience disability. And you have a wonderful article called, "Does God Have Enough Hands?" which is so relevant to our current times during the COVID-19 crisis. So you've been thinking about this for some time, and I'm wondering can you speak a bit about the connection between trauma for people who experience disabilities and why that has been a focus for your work?
Well, first, Roy, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this podcast. And we have known each other for quite a number of years. I'm guessing 40 plus years we've known each other, or when we first met each other, and we were working in Vermont supporting kids who had left the institution in Vermont. And they were all kids who had a diagnosis of autism. But I would come to understand as the years go on that something probably affecting them greatly was post-traumatic stress disorder. I remember I was in a conversation with a mutual friend of ours, Al Vecchione, years ago, in which I was talking to him about a number of people I had met in my practice. I have a private practice for supporting people who have disabilities, who have what are sometimes called difficult behaviors. And from time to time, I get together with Al and tell him about people I've met and share with him things that I've learned and share with him questions I have, because often I'm not sure I'm doing the right thing or being very helpful at all. And Al is one of those people, I know you have people like this in your life as well, who I can just talk to from time to time. And he sometimes helps me to answer questions I've had, but more often helps me to think of completely different questions to ask. Sometimes it's not answers to our old questions as it is changing our questions. And I remember one time just distinctly being up at his house. He was actually putting up sheetrock in an apartment over his garage. And I went and he told me, he was gracious. He said, "More than happy to come and you can sit on the floor and we can talk." And I remember sitting on this dusty floor with him hanging up sheetrock and telling him about all these people I had met and how some were doing fine, but others were just not getting better, and I didn't quite get it. And he said to me, he said, "Well, it sounds like post-traumatic stress disorder to me." And that was the first time, this is probably in the late 1990s, the first time I actually made a connection between PTSD and people who experience disabilities. Prior to that, I had always thought about it as being something that happens to people in military conflicts. The Vietnam War was famous for it. And, it was the first time it came into my understanding that it was even a possibility for people with disabilities. And of course it is. It's amazing that it took me so long, really, in some ways, to put the two together. But it was in a series of conversations with Al and then learning more about PTSD that I came to understand it's really a fundamental root of many people's struggles, and that they're in bodies, physical bodies, that are dysregulated. And when our bodies are dysregulated, they get that way because we have a fight or flight response when we're experiencing any kind of threat. And if sufficient, that threat over time will cause us to shut down. So we're either in our sympathetic or our parasympathetic systems. And one piece I would just add here is that, I'm writing all this down furiously on my pad of paper sitting on Al's floor as he hangs sheetrock. And I said, "So what can you do? How can you help people?" And I expected, a whole bunch of answers, but Al said, one thing you can do is you can help people to move, to aerobically move. And I remember writing that down on my pad of paper, like, oh yeah, exercise is good. It does us all a world of good. And we should eat better and all of those things. I was just sort of making the notes, but then looking at him like, come on, now tell me the real stuff. And he came over, dusty hands, and put his hands right on the cheeks of my face and directed my attention to him. I remember sort of saying, what are you doing? He says, I don't think you understand, people need to move more. And what he was doing is he was emphasizing that aerobic activity is a huge, huge benefit to people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not a small thing, it's a huge thing. And my understanding as time has gone on, it's only been confirmed more and more that it's because people have a giant charge of energy in their bodies. They're in a state of dysregulation. They're hyper vigilant. They're worried about the other shoe dropping. Their bodies are on a regular basis, having gone through trauma. And if you don't help them settle the body down, they can't be in a place where they get better. So what I noticed in my practice is over and over again, I was meeting people that were incredibly dysregulated. They usually had the sympathetic response going on. They were in nervous, highly aroused bodies. Some people I've met are in the opposite, the kind of parasympathetic response, hard for them to get themselves moving at all. But the vast majority of people I meet in my practice are really in the sympathetic system. And if you don't help people to physically move that energy, to change that energy, then it's really hard for them to think clearly about anything or get resolution about their symptoms. That's all possible, but only after you calm down the body.
So that was your introduction to exploring that, and your connection with, referring back to the article. I think that you had produced that, was it after Hurricane Katrina?
Yes, it was. Yes. And that was, of course, after 9/11. But I was asked to do some work in Louisiana after Katrina. And I went to places near New Orleans that were just completely wiped out by the storm. I remember I just underestimated in my imagination how devastating that storm was. And I learned a lot in a week or so that I was there helping. I can't say I was a big change agent in Louisiana at the time. Lots of good people did extraordinary work over the years and continue to do extraordinary work. But I realized that a lot of the things I had been doing were sometimes incorrect. The title of that paper, Does God Have Enough Hands, is from a CBS News reporter, Bill Geist. After 9/11, he tried to talk to his daughter about what had happened, and she was little at the time. And so he was trying to put it in terms that a little girl would understand. And no matter what he said to her, she was overwhelmed and perplexed by what had taken place. And so he said to her, well, honey, it's in God's hands now. And she asked the question, does God have enough hands? Which I just think is just a brilliant insight on her part. And as you mentioned in the opening, Roy, it really does speak to our time. We are in an incredible, unparalleled sort of stress on our society now, and our ability to work together to solve this problem as citizens is just never been more true. It's really, really important that we do that. And it's in all of our hands, this entire crisis.
And so my conversation that I had recently with Karen Harvey, she talks about the experience trauma with people who experience disability, and she connects it, of course, with what we're learning over time or coming to realize, the devastating prevalence of the experience of trauma and abuse, if you were in any marginalized group in our society. Certainly people who experience disability. I think her quotes were a recent study around 7 times more likely to be experiencing abuse, either sexual or physical abuse, if you experience a disability. So is that, and that's why you were, it seems, seeing people in your practice where this was a prevalent characteristic or prevalent experience. Have you, based on your experience with Hurricane Katrina and 9/11, and I would think now, the concern is that with past experience of trauma that you can be re-traumatized. Is that correct? Do I have that correct? And is it something that you're seeing now?
It's absolutely true. First, let me say Karen Harvey is one of the leading authorities on trauma and people with disabilities. And if your listeners have a chance to see her or hear her or read her, it's time well spent. But yeah, when people get traumatized, the likelihood goes up they'll be re-traumatized for any number of reasons, not the least of which is the conditions surrounding them when they're first traumatized don't change. And the second is that they then go into incredibly anxious states. So they become more sensitive about change around them and stress around them than they had been before. It's not unusual, for example, someone who's been sexually or physically assaulted to have a lot of difficulty around the holidays. And the reason for that is because the holidays are stressful for everyone, including perpetrators. So perpetrators tend to become more aggressive during high stressful events, which in turn further victimizes people. So it's one of the things to watch for individuals you might be supporting are things like holidays or birthdays or huge transition events in society, like the coronavirus is making everybody more stressed. I've heard preliminary studies that say the rates of spousal abuse have been climbing since January, when the coronavirus began to hit the country. So it doesn't surprise me at all that people who are stressed are going to feel the effects of early trauma even more acutely during times like this.
And you include in your publications the presentation of a series of tips for helping people. I'm wondering if we could cover some of those in our conversation.
Sure.
What are some of those tips, and what do you think that folks ought to be looking for right now?
Well, one of the things that is, I think, often really traumatizing to people is that the people around them are not assuming that they are competent. One of the things that I always try to teach new people working in this field is to presume competence, to presume that a person understands most of what anybody at that particular age would understand. If they're 21 years old and they have Down syndrome, I assume they understand most things that 21-year-old people understand. There may be things that are difficult for them to understand, or there may be things that they understand better than most typical 21-year-olds. But a presumption of competence. When you and I first entered the field 40 years ago or so, I remember after working in the field for 1 year, I felt like I could go up and meet a person who experienced disabilities and have a pretty good understanding of what they understood or didn't understand. And I was wrong. And now 40 plus years later, I'm getting ready to retire. I hope that I understand less than I did even last year. A presumption of competence is really important. So speaking directly with people about what they're experiencing in terms, avoiding, cliches or avoiding figures of speech that are sometimes difficult for all of us to understand. But speaking it plainly and everyday kind of terms tends to really help people, I think, who are often marginalized, intellectually marginalized. And if nothing else, it shows that it conveys to the person a sense that you think they are important enough to speak directly with them. So I think it's one of those really important things we often don't do. A person may be going through this coronavirus surrounded by people who are there to support them, but nobody ever sits down and talks directly about what this virus is about. There are, by the way, great resources out there for helping people to learn. My wife works for the Autism Center for Excellence, and if you're interested, I'll send you a link you can share with folks of some great materials for teaching kids about this coronavirus and what it means and how it might be. And there you'll see a presumption of competence. I think one of the things that when people feel really anxious, they need lots of assurance about their own safety and well-being. And the more you can assure people reasonably without stretching the truth, that they're okay and you'll be checking in on them and looking out for them, it's really important to communicate the message that the worst is over. We're going to get through this together. It's very helpful to a central nervous system that's really anxious to be assured that there's light at the end of the tunnel. So being hopeful and reassuring, I think, is really, really important. Getting back to as normal a routine as important is the third thing you can do. I think we sometimes, and it's very difficult in this time where we all have to stay pretty socially separate from one another, to get back to some of the routines we were in. Some people I know who experience disabilities, this is the routine they're familiar with, is kind of staying home and not getting out much. So in some ways, it's easy for them to adapt to the times. But a lot of people I know, especially younger people with disabilities these days, they were getting pretty used to having a life that made some sense. They had jobs, they had places to go, and they were a part of their communities. And it may be more difficult in some ways for them to adapt to these times than to others who have been more routinely isolated. A friend I know who runs services says that in their organization, it's the young people who haven't developed trust of their support people yet, who are learning to do that, but just haven't had time because they've just come into the service. They're the ones who are having the most difficult time now laying low. They want to get back to that normal routine. So any kind of sitting down with people and having conversations about, yeah, that's important and we'll get there eventually, but right now we have to get back to as close to normal as we can, makes a lot of sense. We are creatures of habit, and when we're stressed out, we lean back on our habits, our routines, and our rituals, simply because it's less to process information-wise than chaos is. So routines and rituals are really helpful to people. Eating well, this is a good time to be helping people to move aerobically, because lots of folks are going for walks now where they can reasonably keep a good social distance. Some friends of mine who have disabilities are walking now more than ever with their support staff, because it's about the only thing you can do. And it's good. It's helping dampen down some of that excess anxiety or excess arousal in their system. So eating well, getting some exercise turns out to be a great idea. I also, in that list you mentioned, I think fun should be a goal. We get so serious sometimes in our system. We're so determined to teach people skills and get our paperwork done that we lose track of just what a powerful antidote fun and joy can be. And my hope, actually, one of the questions you asked on your list of questions was, we'll get back to a new kind of normal where
Yes.
we'll realize that there's these quality of life issues like eating well and sharing stories and being with each other are just really powerful tools for a
Mm.
healthy human being. And maybe we'll get back to realizing that again and take less seriously some of the uh, frenetic, systems-oriented kind of achieve these goals that we were in before. I think slowing things down might be good for all of us in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, that was something I was just curious about exploring with you, is the idea, as you've referenced, that we are all having the shared experience of isolation. And there has been a focus over time of recognizing that people with disabilities need to be connected to their community, that we need everybody connected and everybody on board, and our communities knit together in whole networks of relationships. So we've always been trying to introduce, build friendships and so on. And now we have this, we all know what it's like now to have that be gone. And if this is sort of, this is a time of sort of a portal of moving from what was before to what can be in the future. You know, how this experience might change our communities. And if you could, if you have thoughts more about, you know, what those, how communities might change, should they? Should we be noticing some things and remembering and bringing that forward with us to do things differently? So you're saying one thing is frenetic pace. Any other ideas on that?
Well, I'm really fascinated with what neuroscientists are learning about our brains, and increasingly the thought is that ours is a very social brain, that we're hardwired for social connection.
Yes.
And this wiring is described in a couple of books. You also wanted some recommendations for books, which I'll share with you later, but there's just some wonderful stuff being written now about how hardwired social connection is to the human brain. Neuroscientists are guessing that about 80% of what our brain is up to at any given point in time is thinking about social connection, 80% of the time. So as one neuroscientist put it, if you're thinking about it, chances are it's in service to your social brain. We're a social species. Our survival as a species depended on our ancestors' ability to become cooperative, to learn ways to work together to pull off survival. And now it's really hardwired right into hardwired into us on a cellular level.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the findings is that people who are socially valued, not people who are powerful, have a lot of money necessarily, or people that are, you know, in the strong side of things, but people that are valued by a community live significantly longer and healthier lives as a whole. It's not a small difference, it's a huge difference. So think of people you've known and admired who have died too young. That happens, but there are many people who live long, good lives who are valued by a community that shows up to express its love when they pass. And neuroscientists believe the reason for this is, and this is a simplification of it, but it's basically the truth of it, is that it's a good survival strategy to follow the model of someone who does good for the larger community. That nature basically rewards that person by saying, gosh, got to keep you around as long as possible so people can imitate you, can follow you, can practice what you teach. And so increasingly it's thought that on a cellular level, doing good for others is absolutely critical to our physical and emotional well-being. And I believe that's one of the things we're going to learn, or I hope that we will learn through this experience, is that showing up for our neighbors, showing up for our family and our friends, even if it's in a Zoom room somewhere, is absolutely critical to our well-being. It's to be socially valued is critical. And I've long believed that that's one of the fundamental roots of suffering for people who experience disabilities, is that they're in these constantly unvalued roles. They are the needy ones. And it is dispiriting to always be the needy one. To never be needed by others is not good for your well-being. So right now, in this time of supporting people, I think finding ways in which people could be helpful to others is absolutely critical to their well-being. If you're a direct support professional, for example, supporting someone who has to stay in all the time now and can't connect with their family, maybe helping them to connect with mom and dad via Zoom or some electronic process, or send them cards or bake things that get delivered safely to their home, puts that person in a valued role. Often people I meet who have disabilities lack much imagination about that because they have lived a life in which the practice is always to be the needy one.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's a strategy I've learned that is the most helpful for helping people get connected to meaningful and enduring relationships, is to help them to make a contribution to others. So I always like to say, get off the disability dime that we're on. As John Kennedy said, ask not what can the community do for people with disabilities, but what can people with disabilities do for the larger community, I think is a really instructive question, and one that really needs to be expressed now, worked through now, because these are times in which people's isolation could lead to an even larger view of them as being needy and dependent and unwelcome by the larger whole.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. That's something that I was talking with Angela Amato a couple of weeks ago, and she said a similar thing, that now is the time where all of those things, those acts of giving, of contributing and helping others can reframe that role and is critical. And it's something that's occurred to me as I see. It's nice to see media be sensitive to or willing to explore, let's say, uneven health impacts. Certain portions of our population, the elderly or people who are in congregate living situations, being more vulnerable to COVID-19. But I do worry about that reinforcement of the idea of here's vulnerable and frail people that are as you say, always recipients of care, always recipients of needs, as opposed to contributors. I love that emphasis. I want to shift, if we could, to another question that's related to this, which is, you and I have both met extraordinary people over our lives who, some who have survived institutionalization, come through that themselves, and are living examples of resilience and strength, as well as folks who have tremendous gifts to offer the larger community, but also have a label of disability. And I'm wondering if you have specific thoughts about how we can, as we come through this as a civilization, as we come through the coronavirus, we get to a point where there's a vaccine and we're pulling things back together again. There's a new normal. There's going to be a need to be open to contribution of everyone. I'm wondering if you have some specific thoughts about how we can remain open to the contributions of people with disability as we work together to become whole again.
Well, it might be that a part of answering that question is that in some ways, introspection, paying attention to how all of these things are impacting us as we try to support folks with disabilities, makes clear that sometimes the people we support have at least as good a handle on things as we do. It's a kind of humbling experience, but what I try to imagine is how little stress I experience in my life, how little trauma I've experienced in my life, and how much other people have. I think, people that have been institutionalized, and I just think, my gosh, they still manage to get up in the morning and face another day and meet new people and try new things. And me, my life has been pretty smooth. I had a good life. I was raised by parents who kept me safe most of the time, and I'm loved by a woman who I adore, and I got kids I love and who love me, and so life is pretty simple. And if I experience even a moderate amount of stress, sometimes I lose my mind. I was telling people about our dishwasher. Sometimes when I'm doing training, I tell them about how my dishwasher broke down at a time when I had broken my leg, and I was bottling up all this anxious energy because my usual strategy for dealing with my anxiety is to aerobically move. I like to be physically active, and Cindy, my wife, says David has only two speeds. He's either moving nonstop or he's sound asleep. I don't have anything in between. So after breaking my leg, I had to lay in bed for about 3.5 months with my leg propped up. I didn't have access to a strategy that helps me to manage this anxiety. And one day I decided I was going to help collect coffee cups and teacups from around the house, put them in the dishwasher, and I grabbed onto the dishwasher rack, which is stuck since the time we bought it. And I had a complete meltdown, an absolute meltdown. And Cindy came rushing in and said, "Oh, baby, aren't you sweet? You're such a good man. You're trying to help out with things, but you just sit on the couch and let me take it from here," because I was ready to yank the machine out of the wall. And on the way to the couch, several emotional things showed up for me. The first was I was really embarrassed. I was embarrassed that I had lost it. I was swearing like a sailor and trying to yank this machine out of the wall. So I was first embarrassed by my behavior. And then I was ashamed. I felt, gosh, on top of everything else Cindy's doing around here, she's doing everything. Now she has to deal with a husband who's losing his mind over the dishwasher. And when I got to the couch, I realized, actually later when I thought about this, I thought, God, I, under a fraction of the stress that people I care about have experienced over the years, I'm losing my frickin' mind. And it was humbling. It brought me to this realization that when I'm with people who have a history of, getting unwound by these things or wound up by these things and have trouble with their behavior, that actually maybe I need advice from them on how to manage things, because I bet if I could feel in my body, even for just 5 minutes, things that people I care about have been experiencing, I would be totally out of my mind. So what I've come to realize is that people are incredibly resilient and optimistic and forward thinking, and me, under a fraction of that amount of stress, becomes disentangled, or not disentangled, all tangled up. I mean, I decompensate is what was happening. And by the way, Cindy came over and brought me some pie. She was sweet to me. And there was no part of me that thought, well, this is cool. In the future, I'm going to routinely melt down because Cindy will come and give me pie, which is so common in our thinking about people with disabilities, is that you can't be nice to them when they're having a hard time because they'll get worse. I sometimes
dishwasher apart all the time.
Yeah. I sometimes have this image of people with disabilities being in smoke-filled rooms at night, smoking cigars, going, one thing that really fucks them up is if you bang your head against a wall. Oh my God, if you want them to give you attention, that's the way to go. Yeah.
Really?
Just amazing. So anyway, that was a long way of answering your very good question of how do we see in people their gifts. But part of it for me is to be introspective and realize what are all these things that show up for me when I'm in people's presence
Yeah.
that are important to me, and to admire that in them, to notice that in them.
Yeah. You know, I'd like to say that we would continue with the axiom "nothing about us without us," right? If we're gonna re-knit ourselves back together again, whether it's after the public health crisis or the economic downturn that's going to happen inevitably, that's about all of us, and making sure, as you're saying, being able to listen and appreciate with everyone at the table. It's the only way it's going to happen, right?
I hope you're right. I think
Yeah.
you might be right. I think you might be right.
So you had mentioned before books that you were reading, things that are inspiring you now and that you would recommend to others. You have thoughts about that, please share them.
Well, there, as I mentioned, there's several books that look at the neuroscience around our social brains that I think are brilliant, in part because they explain something that's incredibly complex in ways that are actually understandable. One of my favorite recents is a book called Social by Michael Lieberman. And it looks at a lot of the current neuroscience. It's a couple of years old now, I think, but a couple of, or looks at the neuroscience, what they're learning about our social brains. They start with a hypothesis that we are highly organized around social relationships. And then they go about the job of testing that. And it's just brilliant, some of the things they're teaching us. One of my desert island books is called Loneliness by John Cacioppo and William Patrick. I actually have it here. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a fabulous starter on this all the neuroscience around this. Another, I'm fascinated by how trauma affects the body, and Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps Score, I think is a really fascinating look at how physically we store information about trauma in our bodies, and then looks at some of the research around things that are really helpful to people, including yoga. Yoga is being shown to be significantly more helpful to people with trauma, with PTSD, even the more severe forms, than most of the drugs or individual or group therapy combined. It's just astonishing what's happening when people can visit their bodies and do things that actually calm down the physical body. So I'd highly recommend that to people who might be interested. I mean, there's dozens of books around not only our social brains, but around trauma and its impact on people. And by the way, one of them, I'll just say it real quick, is Sebastian Junger's book. Oh gosh, have I lost the title? I'm sorry, I've just lost, the title just escaped me. But he looks at, among other things, it was guessed in World War II with the carpet bombing from the Germans of English cities that the rates of anxiety and depression would skyrocket. And it's kind of understandable why that might be a hypothesis. Yeah. But actually they found the opposite, that the rates of anxiety, expressions of anxiety and depression actually decreased. And a belief about why that happened is that people gathered in the subways of the cities together in these huge communities. And it was the power of social relationships that actually, if you will, it created kind of an immunity about some of these things we're so used to thinking about. And I wish, I'm so sorry I can't think of the title of the book. It's a very small book, but it's a really brilliant look. It really kind of turns a lot of things on their head about trauma, but it's just escaping me right now.
Sure, well, we'll put that in the show notes and definitely have a link on our episode page. Fascinating, fascinating.
Yeah. You know what, oh, never mind.
That's okay. Well, I really appreciated our time together, David. Thank you so much for spending a few moments together and exploring this critical question. I'm so happy that you're safe, and it's good to see you.
Thank
And
you,
I
Roy. You too.
already well,
Thank you very much. And I'll stay on, right? You want me to?
please do.